He had spent nearly a decade using the vast ocean as an impenetrable shield, until the day the raging sea delivered to him, with open arms, the exact thing he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. Can you imagine fleeing from the whole world, sailing far away from any human contact, only to find the very reason for your existence floating adrift in the exact place where no one else could reach? This story of unlikely encounters and crossed destinies took place in September of 1912, in the deep, freezing and lonely waters of the North Atlantic, skirting the rugged and imposing coastline of New England. Before we dive into the waves of this emotional story and follow every detail of this journey, I would really love to know how far our tales are sailing today. Leave the name of your city and state here in the comments, because I read them all and love knowing where you're watching from. And if you are passionate about true stories of resilience, fresh starts, and loves that weather any storm, go ahead and hit the like button on this video to support our work, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our travels through time. The smell of sea salt, mixed with the strong aroma of day-old percolated coffee, permeated the small deck of the dark wooden skiff. Luke Vance kept his hands steady on the tiller, his eyes half closed against the freezing wind that cut across a face weathered by the unforgiving sun and the salt of countless voyages. At 38 years old, the New England sailor seemed to carry on his shoulders the same heavy density as the dark waters he navigated. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with pale scars marking his thick knuckles, silent witnesses to years of pulling ropes and taming sails beneath the unpredictable weather of the eastern seaboard. Luke did not smile easily. His face, framed by a rustic beard and dark hair forever tousled by the constant breeze, was a locked fortress. Silence was his most loyal companion, weighing him down like an invisible anchor he had been dragging since the year 1905. In that distant time, a miscalculation of the tides during a sudden squall caused his former boat to capsize. Luke survived, but two grown men, experienced fishermen working under his command, did not share his luck. Guilt, an invisible and merciless monster, swallowed the sailor's soul. Ever since that fateful day, he swore never again to be responsible for anyone's life. He bought a smaller boat, suited for only one crewman, and made a living transporting light cargo alone between the coastal towns, avoiding prolonged conversations, emotional ties, or any closeness that could result in loss. For Luke, the sea was his only safe haven, simply because the ocean, in all its fury and vastness, did not demand love in return and harbored no expectations. His routine was a precision clock guided by the stars and the ocean currents. The only window into his inner world was a leather-bound logbook, weathered by time, whose yellowed pages smelled of pipe tobacco and dampness. There, nestled between precise notes on geographical coordinates, nor'easter winds, and route calculations, the rugged sailor hid almost poetic observations. He wrote about how the full moon spilled liquid silver over the cresting waves, about the exact hue of the horizon moments before dawn, and about the hollow ache in his chest when the silence of the night grew deafening. No one had ever read those pages. They were the thoughts of a man who felt too deeply, but who had learned to lock his heart entirely away. The early hours of September 12th began with a deceptive calm. The sky was clear, studded with brilliant stars reflecting on the mirror-like surface of the water. Luke was sitting on a wooden crate, chewing on a piece of hardtack and drinking water from a metal canteen, when the wind suddenly shifted direction. The air grew heavy, thick with that electric metallic scent that precedes maritime gales. In a matter of minutes, black clouds, dense as coal smoke, swallowed the moonlight. The ocean, previously tranquil, transformed into a roller coaster of furious swells and white foam. Luke moved with the agility of someone who knew every inch of his vessel. He reefed the mainsails, tied down the loose ropes with secure knots, and gripped the tiller with all the strength of his muscular arms, fighting against the current that threatened to capsize the boat. The rain lashed against his skin like whips of ice, and the sound of the wind howling through the masts resembled the cry of a wounded beast. He battled nature's fury for endless hours, his muscles burning with exhaustion, his mind completely emptied of thought, focused solely on raw survival. When morning finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pale, washed-out blue sky and a sea that rolled with the sluggishness of a tired breath. Luke took a deep breath, releasing his tense shoulders. His arms trembled slightly from the extreme exertion. He stepped to the edge of the boat to splash salt water on his face and awaken senses numbed by fatigue. It was at that exact moment, as the golden light of the rising sun struck the calming waves, that his trained eyes caught something unusual on the horizon. It wasn't a fish, nor a drifting tree trunk. It was a cluster of white-painted wooden debris, shattered crates, and torn canvas floating aimlessly. The sailor's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what that meant. A shipwreck. Another vessel had not shared his fortune during the night's tempest. Squinting against the sun's glare on the water, Luke adjusted the tiller and sailed slowly toward the wreckage. The silence there was sepulchral, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against broken wood. There were remnants of a small coastal steamer, the kind that ferried passengers between the states. Luke tasted something bitter in his mouth. He despised stumbling upon the remnants of maritime tragedies, as it always brought his worst ghosts bubbling to the surface. He was about to turn his boat around and sail away, believing there was nothing to be done, when he noticed a faint movement atop a wide piece of shattered deck bobbing a few yards away. A stark color contrasted with the soaked wood. It was a piece of dark fabric. Sharpening his gaze, Luke held his breath. There was a person there. The sailor maneuvered his skiff with surgical precision, approaching the makeshift raft with extreme care to avoid creating a wake that might overturn the survivor. When he was close enough, he grabbed a metal hook tied to a thick rope and pulled the floating debris flush against the side of his boat. Lying on the wreckage, trembling uncontrollably with lips turned purple from the cold, was a woman. She wore a heavy, dark woolen dress, now completely waterlogged and weighing her small frame down. Her dark hair was tangled with seaweed and salt, hiding part of her pale face. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was so shallow it barely moved her chest. Luke did not hesitate. His every instinct for isolation vanished in the face of life's urgency. He leaned over the boat's edge, gripped the woman firmly by the shoulders, and with a single adrenaline-fueled pull, hoisted her onto his deck. Her body fell heavily onto the wooden floorboards. She coughed abruptly, expelling a mouthful of seawater, and slowly opened her eyes. They were large, frightened eyes of a deep, melancholic brown. Luke watched her for a second, fascinated by her fragility and at the same time the invisible strength that had kept her alive in the middle of nowhere. Without saying a word, he hurried to the small covered cabin at the bow, retrieved his thickest, driest woolen blanket, and rushed back. He knelt beside her, wrapped her carefully in the blanket, and rubbed her arms vigorously through the fabric to return some warmth to her frozen body. She looked at him with a mix of absolute panic and profound relief. Luke murmured in a raspy voice, asking her to remain calm, assuring her she was safe now and that the storm had passed. Eleanor Ashford blinked slowly, her mind still clouded by exhaustion and the trauma of the previous night. At 32, the teacher from Boston had thought the sea would be her final resting place. The steamer she was traveling on had collided violently with hidden shoals during the peak of the storm, tearing the hull apart and sinking in a matter of minutes that felt like hours. She had clung to that loose plank with the sheer force of pure desperation, enduring the biting cold and the terror of the darkness, praying silently until her strength simply ran out. Now, bundled in a rough blanket that smelled of tobacco and sea air, she looked at the man with rugged features and incredibly gentle eyes who had pulled her from the abyss. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice was nothing more than a cold, shattered whisper. She asked where they were. Luke took his metal canteen, unscrewed the cap, and helped her take a small sip of fresh water. He answered calmly, explaining that they were in the open ocean, many miles off the New England coast, and that his boat, too, had been blown off its original course by the gale. He briefly introduced himself as Luke Vance, owner of that modest vessel. She took another sip of water, feeling the burn in her throat, and said her name was Eleanor. Her voice gained a little steadiness as warmth returned to her limbs. With eyes welling up from the fresh memories, she recounted the sinking of the small steamer, the deafening crack of breaking wood, and how the waves had dragged her away from everything. Luke listened in absolute silence. His chest tightened with her every word, the ghosts of his own past dancing at the edges of his memory. But he swallowed the dry pain. He stood up slowly, checked the sail riggings, and adjusted their course according to the sun's position. The wind had thrown them far to the south and east. The trip to the island of Nantucket, which should have been short, would now take at least 2 or 3 days of continuous sailing, depending on the goodwill of the currents. The solitary sailor and the woman who had lost everything were now confined to a space of a few square feet, surrounded by nothing but water as far as the eye could see. The first 24 hours on the boat were marked by a respectful, almost palpable silence. Eleanor spent most of the time lying in the small, covered cabin, recovering her depleted energy. The gentle rocking of the sea, now pacified, contrasted sharply with the violence of the day before. Luke kept busy at the tiller, mending small tears the storm had caused in the canvas and consulting his worn maps. He cooked salted fish on a small iron stove and brought her hot tin plates, always maintaining a polite distance. He would watch her out of the corner of his eye when she wasn't looking. He noticed that she was petite, but held an elegant posture, even while wearing the dry, oversized clothes he had lent her. He also noticed that she wore round, wire-rimmed glasses, which she spent hours cleaning meticulously with the corner of a clean cloth, as if they were her most precious treasure. They were, in fact, one of the few things she had left. By the end of the second afternoon, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in dramatic shades of orange, purple, and vivid red. The breeze cooled, and the surface of the ocean reflected that spectacle of colors, like a mirror of molten glass. Eleanor emerged from the cabin for the first time, walking with slightly unsteady steps across the deck until she leaned against the wooden gunwale near where Luke sat. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes to take in the scent of the clean air. When she opened them again, she found the sailor's attentive gaze on her. There was a quiet curiosity between them, an invisible bridge forming over the chasm of their differences. She broke the silence, praising the beauty of the sunset, mentioning that back in Boston, the sky rarely looked so vast and free. Luke cleared his throat, shifting his posture on the wooden crate, and agreed with a slow nod. He commented that the sea had a habit of stealing everything a person owned one day, only to try and apologize with beautiful landscapes the next. Eleanor smiled. A small, slightly crooked but genuinely enchanting smile. That smile disarmed defenses Luke had spent 7 years building brick by brick. It was a moment of extreme simplicity, yet it carried an enormous weight for a man who had forgotten what it was like to converse without a purely commercial purpose. She sat on an overturned empty barrel a few feet from him, and the conversation began to flow with the unhurried pace of calm tides. Eleanor spoke of her life before the tragedy. She explained that she was a teacher, the daughter of a prominent merchant who had been a wealthy and respected man in Massachusetts. However, poor financial investments and the betrayal of a dishonest partner brought the family business to absolute ruin. Her father, a proud man deeply attached to the honor of his name, could not bear the weight of public shame and the collapse of the empire he had built. Profound sorrow consumed his health until he passed away shortly after the bankruptcy. She wasn't merely traveling to Nantucket for a visit, she was moving permanently. She had been hired as a governess to teach the children of a wealthy estate owner on the island, desperately seeking a chance to start over from scratch, far from the gossip and pitying stares of Boston society. There was another wound in her voice, a subtle bitterness that Luke perceived immediately. She mentioned, her eyes fixed on the dark water, that her engagement had been broken the very week her father's financial ruin became public. The man she planned to share her life with, a well-dressed lawyer with beautiful words, had quickly backed away upon discovering his future wife no longer carried her former financial prestige. She had learned the hard way that she was loved for her social standing, not for who she truly was. Since then her heart had hardened. She trusted books, hard work, and the chalk of a classroom far more than she trusted human promises. Luke listened intently to every word. This woman's pain didn't involve the sea, it involved the selfishness and cruelty of people on dry land, but he understood the feeling of loss and isolation better than anyone. In a rare moment of vulnerability, the rugged sailor lowered his guard. He looked at his own calloused hands resting on his lap and revealed to her the reason he traveled alone. With a voice deeper and quieter than usual, Luke narrated the events of 1905. He spoke of the unforeseen gale, the desperation of trying to keep the boat facing the mountainous waves, and the moment nature's might overcame the strength of men. He explained, his eyes fixed on an invisible spot on the floorboards, that he had lost 2 loyal crewmen, strong, good men who had trusted his judgment. He confessed that the guilt haunted him through countless sleepless nights. He said he chose to be alone because loneliness was an easier burden to carry than the responsibility for another human soul. Eleanor listened to his confession in absolute silence. She offered no empty words of comfort, didn't say it wasn't his fault, nor did she try to soothe the pain that clearly still bled in the sailor's chest. Instead, she stood up slowly, walked over to him, and defying all the rules of distance that the era demanded, placed her small, warm hand over Luke's massive, rough one. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but the electricity of that gesture coursed through the man's entire body. She said softly that the worst storms do not happen in the ocean, but within our own minds, and that hiding from the rain never stops the sky from falling. Luke looked up, meeting her gaze. For the first time in a long while, he saw neither pity nor accusation in another person's eyes. He saw understanding. He saw a soul that was also covered in scars, and yet had the courage to try and reach for his. The third night aboard was different from all the others. The sky was pristine, an endless carpet of black velvet dotted with thousands of distant diamonds. The sea was so serene it reflected the constellations with stunning clarity. The wind blew warm and pleasant. Luke was at the tiller, but his posture was relaxed. Eleanor sat beside him, her legs tucked in, gazing upward. The sailor, in a gesture that surprised even himself, began pointing at the sky. He taught her how to find the North Star, explaining how navigators used Orion's belt to calculate distances and set courses on days when the compass seemed confused. His voice was deep and rhythmic, revealing an intimate and passionate knowledge of that universe of salt and light. She followed his finger tracing the air, completely mesmerized by the practical wisdom of this rugged-looking man. In exchange for his knowledge of the stars, Eleanor went to the cabin and brought back the only thing she had managed to save intact from the shipwreck, safely tucked deep in her coat pocket. A small book, the edges of its pages slightly warped by dampness, containing classic tales and poetry. She opened the booklet with extreme care, and by the weak light of an oil lamp hanging from the mast, began to read aloud. Her voice was sweet, melodious, Accustomed to holding the attention of classrooms full of students, she read of distant lands, ancient gardens, and the beauty of time passing without haste. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, allowing her voice to fill the empty, silent spaces of his boat and his mind. It was a scene of deep, quiet intimacy. Veiled flirtations emerged in the pauses between her reading. When she read a line about the courage to brave the unknown, she would lower the book slightly and look at him over the metal rims of her glasses, holding his gaze for a second longer than necessary. When he offered her more coffee, his fingertips would lightly brush against her hand, and neither of them pulled away. Luke's heart, which he believed hardened forever, beat erratically in a frighteningly familiar and wonderful way. On the morning of the fourth day, a thin mist covered the surface of the water, dissipating slowly as the sun warmed the air. Luke was standing, adjusting the mainsail, when he spotted the dark silhouette of dry land breaking the horizon line. The island of Nantucket, with its rolling moors and jagged contours, emerged on the horizon like a painting coming to color. He should have been relieved. The rescue was successfully completed, and the mission to keep the woman safe was fulfilled. But as he watched the island draw nearer, an icy grip took hold of the sailor's chest. Reaching port meant returning to solid ground. It meant the suspended time they had lived in those past few days would come to an end. She would go look for her new employer, start her new life teaching on an estate far from the sea, and he would go back to sailing alone, returning to the deafening silence of his empty routine. Eleanor emerged from the cabin and walked to the bow. She leaned against the wooden rail and watched the land appearing through the fog. The wind tossed her dark hair. She remained silent for a long time, absorbing the reality of returning to the real world. The town, with its old cobblestone streets, gradually revealed its bustling harbor. Masts of other ships piercing the sky, brick warehouses lined up along the waterfront, and dozens of people moving frantically like worker ants. The pure smell of the sea was swiftly replaced by the pungent odor of wood smoke, fresh fish being traded, and human sweat. The noise of the docks, filled with the shouts of stevedores, wagons creaking over uneven stones, and distant church bells, invaded the sacred space they had built on the ocean. Luke maneuvered the skiff with his usual dexterity, dodging smaller fishing boats and docking at a sturdy wooden pier away from the main cargo unloading area. He tossed the thick rope over a dark wooden piling and tied the vessel off securely. The sound of the boat's timber scraping against the dock's rubber siding sounded like the final period at the end of a long paragraph. He turned to Eleanor. The woman stood perfectly straight, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of her borrowed clothes, clutching the small book tightly to her chest like a shield. Luke cleared his suddenly dry throat. He said, with a formality he hadn't used in days, that they had arrived safe and sound. He jumped onto the dock with agility and extended his large, calloused hand to help her disembark. Eleanor hesitated for a second. She looked around the boat, registering every detail of that tiny space that had saved her from death, and taught her that stars were more than just lights in the sky. She took his hand and stepped onto the solid wood of the pier. Her legs buckled momentarily, overly accustomed to the eternal sway of the waves, and Luke caught her by the waist, firmly yet delicately, to keep her from falling. They stood entirely too close, their faces mere inches apart. The scent of tobacco, coffee, and sea salt emanating from him seemed like the most comforting thing in the world to her. Neither of them moved hastily. They let go of each other slowly, with a silent, heavy reluctance. Eleanor had nowhere to go and knew absolutely no one on the island. The original plan was to be met at the main port by the foreman of the wealthy estate owner who hired her, but since the ship she originally traveled on never arrived, and she had shown up days later on an unknown boat, no one was waiting for her. Luke noticed her discomfort and the silent panic in her eyes facing the chaos of the port. Without asking permission, he took the lead. He took the reins of the situation and guided her through the narrow, irregular cobblestone streets of the lower town. He knew that labyrinth of alleys perfectly. They walked in silence for about 20 minutes until they arrived in front of an old two-story house painted a faded yellow, with green vines climbing the side walls and wide wooden windows painted navy blue. The sign hanging over the double doors read, "Mrs. Pruitt's Boarding House." Luke quickly explained that this was the safest, cleanest and most honest place in the Port District, ideal for her to settle in before trying to locate the estate owner who hired her. They entered the spacious lobby, which smelled of beeswax, lye soap and warm pound cake. Behind a polished wooden counter stood the proprietress, Mrs. Martha Pruitt was a woman of 55, short in stature, broad-shouldered, with a round, jovial face that belied the stark white hair pulled into a strict bun at the top of her head. The widow was known throughout the port for her sharp tongue, her hearty meals, and her incredible ability to uncover anyone's secrets in less than 5 minutes of conversation. As soon as she saw them walk in, the older woman's small, bright eyes darted from Luke to the unknown woman beside him with the curiosity of a professional investigator. The sailor removed the woolen cap he always wore and greeted the woman politely. Mrs. Pruitt broke into a wide, teasing smile. She declared loudly that it had been quite a while since the sea-wolf had stepped on her clean wooden floors, and that she was even more surprised to see him accompanied by such a refined lady, despite the wrinkled state of her clothes. Luke's expression hardened, disliking the direction of the joke, and he explained flatly and directly, without delving into morbid details, that the lady was a teacher who had faced serious trouble on her voyage to New England, and needed a comfortable room for a few days until she could contact her employers out of town. The widow, sensing Luke's serious tone and rigid posture, dropped the jokes and instantly adopted a welcoming demeanor. She quickly stepped out from behind the counter, took Eleanor's cold hands with maternal affection, and assured her the teacher would be in excellent hands, guaranteeing a street-facing room with the best breeze in the house and a hot bath prepared immediately. Luke reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, opened it to reveal coins he kept from his personal reserves, and placed a considerable amount of money on the wooden counter. He told the woman to deduct not only the room and board for the coming days, but also to procure clean, proper clothing for Eleanor, since she had lost absolutely all her luggage and belongings at sea. The teacher's eyes widened at the gesture, and she immediately protested, her voice rising an octave. She refused to accept it. She argued that he had already done enough by saving her life, that she couldn't take money from a hard-working man who lived off the sea, and that as soon as she presented herself to the estate owner, she would ask for an advance on her wages and pay for her own boarding. Luke turned to her, his expression completely impassive, and said with absolute firmness that debts of the sea are not collected on land. He added that she was in no condition to walk the streets of the island looking for work dressed like that, and that refusing essential help at a time like this wasn't pride. It was stubbornness. His response was so definitive, carrying such an imposing tone of rustic authority, that Eleanor fell silent, swallowing hard. She lowered her head slightly, thanking him with a faint murmur, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment at her total dependency. The sailor nodded respectfully to Mrs. Pruitt, turned his back, and walked toward the exit. Eleanor took a step forward, almost calling him back, feeling a sudden void open in her stomach. The absence of his massive presence seemed to drain the air from the room. She called his name softly before he crossed the threshold. Luke stopped, his back to the busy street, and turned his face over his shoulder, his dark eyes meeting hers. She asked, her voice thick and full of uncertainty, if they would see each other again. The silence that followed seemed to last for hours. The man of the sea looked away to the cobblestones. He answered that the ocean is vast and the world is small, but that he had cargo to pick up in the northern coastal villages the very next morning, and his destination was always uncertain. It was a perfect, polite, and distant excuse. A lie they both knew he was telling to protect his own internal walls. Without another word, Luke adjusted his cap and vanished into the harbour crowd. Eleanor stood frozen in the lobby, suddenly feeling intensely more lonely amidst all those people than she had in the days she sailed alone with him on the vast ocean. Mrs. Pruitt, who had watched the entire scene with the clinical eyes of someone who understands unspoken sorrows, touched the young woman's shoulder gently, called her dear, and guided her up the narrow stairs to a bright, impeccably clean room on the second floor. In the hours that followed, Eleanor took the promised hot bath, feeling the water wash away the crust of sea salt from her skin and hair. She dressed in clean cotton clothes the widow lent her, simple, yet dignified and fresh-smelling, ate a whole bowl of hearty vegetable stew and lay down on the soft bed. Profound exhaustion pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep, where the floor still seemed to sway to the rhythm of the waves. The next day dawned with a vibrant blue sky, free of clouds. Eleanor woke up early, feeling physically and mentally restored. The courage she had lost in the ocean had returned. After drinking strong black coffee in Mrs. Pruitt's spacious kitchen, she asked the woman for the address of the commercial office of the estate owner who had hired her. The widow, who knew the island's bigwigs like the back of her hand, detailed the route, advising her that the office was located downtown, near the main square. With a folded piece of paper containing the exact address in her hands, the teacher stepped out into the bustling streets of Nantucket, determined to regain control of her life and somehow repay the money to Luke. The walk downtown was revealing. The town breathed commerce and life. Wooden wagons pulled by strong mules kicked up dust in the streets. Gentlemen in light linen suits discussed business on the sidewalks, and the smell of roasted coffee lingered on almost every corner. Eleanor found the majestic brick building that served as the commercial hub for the textile and farming estate where she was to work. The brass plaque on the wall was polished, indicating a prosperous enterprise. She walked into the airy lobby, waited her turn, and when she approached the main counter, she gave a tired-looking clerk her name and the purpose of her visit. She stated she was the governess hired by Mr. Arthur Sterling to instruct his children on the estate, and explained her delay was due to the shipwreck of the coastal steamer. The clerk stopped writing in his ledger, looked up, and stared at her with an expression that mixed shock and profound pity. He took off his reading glasses, set his pen on the desk, and let out a heavy sigh. In a grave, formal voice, the man apologized for her ordeal, but delivered devastating news. He explained that Mr. Sterling had suffered a massive heart attack exactly 3 days ago, passing away in the middle of the night. The entire family was in deep mourning. The estate was undergoing a complex probate process, and all hires and renovations had been immediately cancelled by the heirs, who intended to sell the property and move to New York. The schoolroom that was to operate inside the estate no longer existed. The job for which Eleanor had travelled miles away, for which she had nearly died at sea, simply vanished into thin air, like mist. The teacher felt her legs lose their strength and the air escape her lungs. She gripped the wooden edge of the counter to keep from collapsing right there. The floor seemed to have vanished beneath her feet once again, opening up an abyss of uncertainties. Penniless, jobless, without family, and in a town where she knew only a widowed boarding-house owner and a sailor closed off to the world, the situation was beyond desperate. She thanked the clerk with an almost inaudible whisper, turned, and walked out of the office. The sun outside continued to shine brightly, oblivious to the internal storm raging in the woman's mind. She wandered aimlessly down the sidewalks, her eyes glued to the uneven stones, desperately trying to formulate a survival plan. She could look for work in town, take in sewing, or try for a spot in smaller schools. But that took time she didn't have, because the funds Luke had provided would cover only a few more days at the boarding house. Completely submerged in her dark thoughts, Eleanor bumped hard into a short man carrying a leather briefcase overflowing with papers, spilling almost all the documents onto the dusty sidewalk. She apologized repeatedly, mortified by her own clumsiness, and knelt immediately to help the gentleman gather the pages fluttering in the breeze. The man muttered something under his breath, adjusting a pair of half-moon glasses that threatened to slide off the tip of his round nose. He possessed a thick white moustache that covered his lips, looking like a character straight out of an antique novel. He thanked her for the help, organizing the folders quickly. As he took the last paper from Eleanor's hand, he fixed his gaze on the young woman's face and frowned, his small eyes sparkling with a curious familiarity. He squinted against the sunlight and asked, in an incredibly measured tone of voice, if she happened to be a relative of Catherine Ashford. Eleanor went rigid as a statue. Catherine Ashford was the maiden name of her late mother, a woman who had been born on this very island long before moving to Boston, marrying and living through the family's financial tragedy. She answered affirmatively, her voice trembling with surprise, confirming she was Catherine's legitimate daughter. The man let out a long, deep sigh, cleaning the lenses of his half-moon glasses on the edge of his dark, rumpled suit jacket. He straightened his posture, lifted his chin, and formally introduced himself as Silas Abernathy, the chief clerk of the county. With a tone of voice that blended bureaucratic authority and fascination at the enormous coincidence of fate, the clerk explained that he had been searching for her or any representative of her mother's family for almost 8 months. Intrigued, Eleanor followed Silas Abernathy to the county registry building, located 2 blocks away. The interior of the building smelled of old dust, wax, and bitter coffee, with endless stacks of files piled on dark wooden desks. The clerk guided her to his private office, closed the door to ensure privacy, and asked her to sit in a high-backed chair upholstered in old leather. He walked over to a heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner, pulled open a squeaky drawer, and extracted a thin manila folder, which he placed carefully on the desk between them. Silas explained, pointing to the yellowed papers, that Eleanor's mother, Catherine, had a distant and highly reclusive great-uncle who lived in the rural northern moors of the island. This man had passed away nearly a year ago, leaving no direct heirs. After months of frustrating bureaucratic searches through the tangled branches of the family tree, the registry had arrived at the name of Eleanor's mother, who, being deceased, passed the inheritance rights directly to her daughter. Eleanor stared at the documents with wide eyes, her breath caught in her throat. She was the sole and legitimate heir to a rural property located on the northern edges of the island. It wasn't a grand, wealthy estate like the one belonging to the man who had hired her. The clerk was very clear about that. According to the old records he read aloud, it was a large, fertile plot of wooded land with a spacious timber-frame farmhouse, badly dilapidated due to abandonment, but situated near a clean freshwater spring and boasting excellent soil for cultivation. The property was free of state debts, waiting only for someone to sign the legal paperwork, take possession of the rusted keys, and occupy the land. It was as if destiny, right after dealing her the devastating blow of losing her job, had suddenly extended a hand in a spectacular gesture of redemption. She wouldn't have to beg for work on the streets or return defeated to the mockery of society in her hometown. She had a place, she had a roof, old walls that could be cleaned and mended, a piece of land where she could start over from scratch however she saw fit. Silent tears streamed down her face, smudging the thin lenses of her round glasses. She took the silver fountain pen the clerk offered and, with hands shaking uncontrollably, signed each of the lengthy legal documents required, making the transfer of property into her name official. The clerk filed the papers away and smiled at her compassionately. He handed her a heavy ring of rustic iron keys and explained that the office would arrange a buggy the next morning to take her out to the property so she could inspect it and settle in. Eleanor thanked him profusely, her voice choked with emotion, bowing slightly in respect to the man before rushing out of the registry. She walked back toward Mrs. Brewitt's boarding house with swift, light steps, her heart pounding erratically and overflowing with a vibrant hope she hadn't felt in years. She needed to find Luke before he set sail with his cargo the next morning. She had to tell him about this stunning twist of fate and thank him for dropping her off in the right town at the right time. Perhaps her smile, as she delivered this news, might make him change his mind about leaving. Perhaps there was a place for his heart to anchor in that new home she would raise from the ruins. As the teacher hurried down the busy streets, completely absorbed by the wonderful possibilities of her new future, she turned the corner leading to the main harbor promenade without paying attention to her surroundings. The sweet, cloying smell of a cigar wafted nearby. Eleanor bumped lightly into the shoulder of a tall man, dressed in an elegant, flawlessly tailored dark suit, who was casually chatting with a traveling salesman in the doorway of a shop. She turned quickly, murmuring a generic apology, but the voice died painfully in the back of her throat before it even crossed her lips. The man she had bumped into turned around slowly, removing the cigar from his mouth with an elegant, perfectly calculated motion. Cold grey eyes fixed on her with a chilling intensity, and a perfectly rehearsed smile, that same calculating smile full of superficial charm she had known so well in the past, curved his lips. The blood ran cold in Eleanor's veins. The entire world seemed to stop spinning, and all the sounds around her were muffled by a sharp ringing in her ears. Standing before her in the middle of a bustling square of a town he detested for being excessively rustic was Desmond Foster. The lawyer who had abandoned her in her family's moment of greatest financial despair was there, alive, imposing and smiling, blocking out the sun. He wasn't there for a leisurely stroll. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes flashing with a veiled greed that only she knew intimately, and in a polished, venomous drawl, he spoke her name, saying he had searched for her for tireless days, and that the tides always bring back what rightfully belongs to us. The chill that seized the young woman's soul didn't come from the sea breeze of that late afternoon, but from the terrifying realization that the darkness of her past hadn't drowned in the ocean. It had survived, crossed the same treacherous waters, and had just dropped anchor right in front of the brilliant fresh start she had barely gotten the chance to build. And while Desmond offered his arm to lead her down a path of lies and false good intentions, far back on the docks, away from the lawyer's threatening eyes, a dark-eyed sailor, who was supposed to be organizing ropes and leaving forever, watched the scene in complete and absolute silence, feeling the protective instinct of ancient storms boiling dangerously in his veins, ready to change the winds of this story forever. The shock of seeing Desmond Foster standing in the middle of the bustling Nantucket Square was so violent that Eleanor felt the air sucked from her lungs all at once. The uneven cobblestones seemed to sink beneath her feet, as if she were back on the deck of that sinking steamer in the middle of the storm. The lawyer was impeccable, just as he used to be in the drawing rooms of Boston. The light linen suit he wore didn't have a single crease. His felt hat rested in his left hand with rehearsed elegance, and the sweet, cloying smell of the cigar he smoked instantly turned her stomach. The smile on his lips was perfectly measured, neither too wide to look fake to the eyes of passers-by, nor too restrained to hide the triumph of having found her. The teacher took an instinctive step backward, her fingers gripping the fabric of the simple dress the boarding-house widow had lent her, her breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. Before we continue sailing through the rough seas of this reunion and discover how this tide will turn, Don't forget to like this video if you are already rooting for this love born on the ocean and want to see our protagonist bounce back. And of course, if you aren't subscribed yet, click the red button below to join our community passionate about unforgettable stories. Desmond's voice, polished and velvety, sliced through the noise of wagons and harbour peddlers like a cold blade. He said, tucking his cigar into a small silver case in his jacket pocket, that he had looked for her for whole weeks. He claimed, with an expression of feigned concern, that when he read about the terrible sinking of the coastal steamer in the newspapers, his heart almost stopped beating. He took a step toward her, extending his free hand in a gesture of familiarity and possession that made her recoil even further. He kept talking, his voice soft and persuasive, saying he couldn't sleep at night, imagining what might have happened to his beloved Eleanor, and that he had travelled north immediately as soon as rumours of survivors began to circulate through the ports. The teacher's eyes widened behind the round lenses of her glasses, the blood pounding in her temples. The cynicism of that man was almost tangible. He wasn't there because he cared about her. He had vanished the exact moment her father declared bankruptcy, breaking their engagement with the same ease one tears an unimportant piece of paper, leaving her to face ruin and grief, completely alone. Eleanor lifted her chin, summoning all the strength she had recovered during those quiet days at sea beside Luke. She crossed her arms defensively and replied, her voice laced with a cutting coldness, that it was a pity he had gone to so much unnecessary trouble. She stated, looking directly into his cold, calculating grey eyes, that there was nothing for him there, that the life they had planned together had sunk long before the steamer hit the rocks, and that she didn't need, much less want, the fake concern of a man who only knew how to love the balance of a bank account. The smile on the lawyer's lips faltered for a fraction of a second, a minuscule crack in his mask of perfection, but he recovered almost instantly. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, stepping close enough for her to smell the strong cologne he wore. Desmond argued that she was being unfair, that he had been pressured by his own family to distance himself during the financial crisis, but that things were different now. He said, his eyes gleaming in a strange way, that he had come to make amends, to take her back to Boston, restore her honor, and take care of what was rightfully theirs. The mention of the word rightfully triggered a blaring alarm in Eleanor's mind. The heavy leather satchel containing the copies of the documents that Clerk Silas Abernathy had just handed her, certifying she was the sole owner of the lands in the northern moors, seemed to burn against her hip. Realization hit her with the force of a punch to the gut. Desmond Foster wasn't there because of a miraculous romantic repentance or because the newspapers announced the shipwreck. He was a cunning and extremely well-connected lawyer. He had informants in the civil registry offices, people who scoured unrepresented inheritance files. He knew about the death of her distant great-uncle. He knew about the land. He knew that, with her father's bankruptcy and no other living relatives, she would be the sole legal heir to that entire property. He had travelled to Nantucket not to rescue a bride lost at sea, but to ensure a valuable estate didn't slip through his refined, greedy fingers. Eleanor took another step back, repulsion evident in every line of her face. She spelled it out for him, her voice trembling with restrained anger, that he was a despicable man, and that never under any circumstances would she get back together with him or sign any paper he put in front of her. Desmond's face hardened immediately. The mask of the concerned fiancé shattered, revealing the arrogant, controlling expression he hid so well beneath his upper-class breeding. He shoved his hands into his trouser pockets, his posture turning instantly threatening, and stated in a low, dangerous tone that she was alone, penniless, without a reputation, and in a town of strangers. He pointed out, with surgical cruelty, that a single woman without means couldn't manage a ruined farmhouse, that the back taxes would soon swallow her up. and that if she were even slightly intelligent, she would accept his legal help before she lost everything for the second time. He concluded by saying he would be staying at the finest hotel in town for a few days, waiting for common sense to finally illuminate her stubborn head. Desmond turned his back on her without waiting for an answer and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her trembling with fury and a silent, icy fear. Meanwhile, a few yards away from the main square, leaning against the rough brick wall of a dry goods warehouse, Luke Vance watched the entire scene. He had left the docks right after finishing organizing the rigging on his skiff, initially intending to look for cheap provisions in the central market before setting sail the next morning heading north. But the instincts that had kept him alive in the roughest seas for years flared the moment he saw the teacher shrink her shoulders and back away from that well-dressed man. The sailor couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged due to the deafening clatter of passing wagons, but he didn't need to hear them. The body language screamed the truth. He saw the panic in Eleanor's eyes, saw the predatory, controlling stance of the man in the suit, and felt a primal fury boil in his blood, an irrational urge to cross the street and throw that dandy into the murky waters of the harbor. But Luke was a practical man, forged in the hardship of patience and observation. He waited for the dandy to leave, saw Eleanor take several deep breaths to hold back tears of frustration, and waited for her to begin walking back toward the street of Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house. The sailor pushed off the brick wall and followed the teacher at a safe distance, his heavy footsteps muffled by the street noise. He didn't want to frighten her, but the thought of leaving her alone, vulnerable in a town that was proving increasingly hostile, caused a physical, painful ache in his chest, an ache very different from the old guilt he usually carried. He trailed her until he saw her safely enter through the double wooden doors of the boarding house. Only then did Luke stop at the opposite corner, lean against a gas street lamp, and pull his inseparable logbook from his pocket. The leather cover was worn from constant use. He took a stub of a pencil, and in the rugged, heavy handwriting that contrasted with the poetry of the words, began to write down that day's observations. He wrote that the open ocean taught men there are monsters in the depths, but that dry land was far more dangerous because its monsters walked in light linen suits and smiled while plotting to steal the light from others. He noted finally that anchors aren't just for holding boats to the sea floor. They are also meant to keep precious things from being swept away by the current. He closed the logbook, tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, and made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He did not set sail the next morning. 3 days passed since the fateful encounter in the square. Eleanor's routine turned into a desperate race against time and the town's oppressive bureaucracy. Clerk Silas Abernathy had kept his promise. The day after their meeting, a buggy rented by the registry took the teacher to the property she had inherited, located in the island's northern moors. The journey was long and bumpy. When she stepped down from the buggy, she was met with the brutal reality of her new inheritance. The land was indeed vast and gorgeous. There were enormous fruit trees, vines with colorful flowers climbing the trunks, and the constant sound of a clean freshwater spring cutting through the rocks in the back. But the main timber frame house, where the great-uncle had lived as a recluse, was in an advanced state of decay. The shingled roof had massive holes where the rain poured in freely. The windows had shattered glass, the floorboards creaked dangerously, and tall weeds invaded the front porch like a silent, green army. The teacher walked through the dusty rooms, shooing away birds and spiderwebs, feeling the gigantic weight of the challenge before her. To clean it, fix the roof, replace the rotten wood, and make that place habitable and productive again, she would need money, heavy tools, and strong arms, and she had absolutely none of those things. She returned to town with her mind working frantically on impossible calculations. The deadline set by the registry for her to pay the title transfer taxes and take permanent possession of the land was running out fast. If she didn't settle those fees, a modest amount for a wealthy farmer, but an unreachable fortune for an unemployed teacher, the property would go to public auction, and that was exactly the legal loophole Desmond Foster was waiting for. The cunning lawyer knew the inheritance hung by a thread of financial red tape and was circling the registry doors like a vulture, ready to buy the land for pennies on the dollar as soon as her deadline expired, or force her to sign a partnership contract in exchange for the tax money. Eleanor spent the next 2 nights wide awake, sitting on the edge of the bed in Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, doing and redoing math on small scraps of paper by the dim light of a candle. She considered selling family heirlooms, but remembered with a bitter taste in her mouth that creditors had seized them months before her voyage. She thought about asking for a loan at the town bank, but no manager would extend credit to an unmarried woman without guarantors. Despair began to take the place of hope. On the morning of the 4th day, with dark, sunken eyes from exhaustion, she walked down the boarding house stairs for breakfast. The smell of freshly baked cornbread and strong coffee filled the pleasant air of the dining room, but her stomach was completely tied in knots of anguish. She sat at an isolated table in the corner, stirring her coffee with a metal spoon, with no desire to drink it. It was then that the heavy, double wooden doors of the boarding house opened, letting in a beam of golden morning sunlight and the unmistakable silhouette of the man she thought was miles away, sailing the deep waters of the northern coast. Luke Vance walked into the dining room with long, confident strides. He wore the same thick, dark trousers, worn leather boots, and a white cotton shirt that sharply contrasted with his sun-baked skin. He wasn't wearing his usual woolen cap, leaving his thick, dark hair slightly messed by the morning wind. His presence altered the gravity of the entire room. Mrs. Pruitt, who was wiping the counter with a damp cloth, immediately stopped what she was doing, her round eyes widening as she broke into a broad, mischievous smile. The teacher from Boston dropped the spoon into her cup with a shrill, metallic clink. Her heart skipped not one, but several beats in a row. She blinked behind her glasses, thinking for an insane moment that her lack of sleep was making her see beloved ghosts. But he was real. He walked straight to her table, his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. Luke didn't ask for permission. He pulled out the wooden chair opposite her and sat down, resting his rugged, calloused arms on the table. The scent of tobacco, sea salt and soap emanating from him felt like the safest anchor she had ever found in her life. He asked, his deep, rough voice cutting through the silence of the table, why she wasn't eating. She tried to answer, but her throat felt full of sand. She swallowed hard and, in an almost inaudible whisper, acknowledged that he hadn't sailed. He confirmed it with a slow nod, his eyes never leaving her face, and bluntly explained that the northern cargo could wait a few more days, and that he had pending, much more important business on the island that needed his immediate attention. He didn't mention seeing the fight in the square. He didn't mention the man in the suit or the fear in her eyes. He just leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them, and asked, in an incredibly calm and practical tone, what was stealing her sleep and painting those dark shadows under her eyes. The protective barrier Eleanor had erected over the last few days simply crumbled in the face of that raw honesty. The strength she was faking vanished, and with a voice choked by unshed tears, she told him everything. She recounted the miraculous discovery of the inheritance left by her great-uncle, described the deplorable state of the wooden farmhouse and the wooded lot, and laid out the impossible financial problem of the government registry taxes. And finally, with her hands trembling on the tabletop, she confessed the terrifying return of Desmond Foster. She explained who he had been in the past, The broken engagement after her father's bankruptcy, and the lawyer's obvious, disgusting intention to use her bureaucratic vulnerability to steal the only thing of value she had left in the world. Luke listened to every word without interrupting, his facial expression gradually hardening as if turning to stone, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his hands on the table. When she finished speaking, a solitary tear escaped her eye and traced a wet path down her pale cheek. The sailor raised his right hand, a slow, careful movement, and, with the rough pad of his calloused thumb, wiped the tear from her face. The touch was so light and full of profound meaning that a shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. Luke slowly pulled his hand back, leaned against the backrest of the chair, and said with the firmest, most unshakable voice she had ever heard that she didn't need to be afraid anymore. He informed her, in a practical tone as if they were plotting a ship's course, that he would go down to the registry with her that very day, pay the back taxes for the property transfer in full, and that the two of them would head up into the hills tomorrow to start fixing the damn roof of that house. The teacher's eyes went wide, the shock paralyzing her vocal cords for a long second. When she finally found her voice, she protested vehemently, shaking her head and saying he couldn't do that. She argued that she had no way to pay back the loan, that she already owed him her life and her boarding money, and that she would not let him empty the savings of a lifetime of hard work at sea for a problem that was hers alone. The sailor let out a heavy sigh, crossed his arms over his broad chest, and looked at her with an intensity that seemed to read the bottom of her soul. He answered, punctuating every word, that the money he kept in a locked chest at the bottom of his skiff did nothing but gather dust and feed moths, because he had no family, no vices, and no plans. He added that her problems had ceased being just hers the exact second he pulled her from the freezing ocean waters onto his boat, and that if that dressed-up lawyer thought he could just steal what belonged to her, he was going to find out the hard way that men of the sea don't get scared by linen suits and fancy words. The weight of that promise, Luke's unshakable solidity, broke Eleanor's last line of resistance. She stopped protesting. She simply nodded, feeling a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy, and smiled through her tears, a smile that lit up the whole room and made the sailor's heart pound in a completely erratic rhythm. That same warm afternoon, the two walked together to the main registry office in Nantucket. Luke's imposing and silent presence beside Eleanor caused the people on the narrow streets to step aside involuntarily. They entered the building smelling of dust and wax and requested an immediate meeting with the chief clerk, Silas Abernathy. The white-mustached man received them in his closed office, surprised but visibly pleased by the heir's return. Luke placed a heavy, small canvas sack on the clerk's desk. The sound of gold and silver coins clinking against the wood echoed through the quiet room. He instructed the clerk, politely but categorically, to calculate every penny of the taxes, back fees, and required levies to release the land deed in Eleanor Ashford's name immediately. Silas Abernathy blinked a few times, adjusting the half-moon glasses on his nose, picked up his fountain pen, and furiously began doing the math on a piece of scrap paper. While the clerk worked the numbers, the heavy wooden door of the private office swung open abruptly, slamming against the wall with a violent crash that startled the whole registry. Desmond Foster stormed into the room like a furious hurricane. He wore a dark suit jacket, his face was red with rage, and his perfectly rehearsed composure was entirely gone. The lawyer had been tipped off by one of his corrupt informants that the teacher was in the building with the money to finalize the transfer, thus ruining all his carefully laid plans for a hostile takeover of the land. He loudly demanded to know what was going on there, pointed a threatening finger in Eleanor's direction, and fired off that she had no right to transfer those lands into her name without his consent, lying shamelessly that he still held engagement rights recognized by law. Before Eleanor could open her mouth to reply, or before the poor clerk could stammer a legal explanation about the heir's independence, Luke Vance stood up from his high-backed chair. The sailor's movement was slow, deliberate, and incredibly menacing. The difference in size and physical presence between the two men was glaring. Luke didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, nor did he point a finger. He simply walked over until he was inches away from the furious lawyer, the shadow of his broad shoulders completely blocking the light from the window. With a voice that was low, raspy, and dangerous, like the sound of rocks breaking underwater, Luke informed the man in the suit that he had walked into the wrong room. The sailor calmly advised him to lower his hand before he lost it, and explained crystal clearly that Miss Eleanor was the sole owner of those lands and owed no answers, explanations, or absolutely anything to a man who runs away from financial storms. Desmond took an instinctive step back, his bravado wilting in the face of the real and imminent physical danger emanating from the hardened New Englander. But his bruised pride wouldn't allow him to retreat in silence. He scoffed, adjusted his jacket lapels with trembling hands, and shot back a bitter sneer on his lips that the sailor didn't know who he was dealing with, and that a rugged boatman wouldn't last a month trying to manage prime real estate. He gave a dry laugh and hurled a final venomous threat in Eleanor's direction, saying she would soon be destitute again and he would make sure to watch the fall from the front row. Luke didn't lose his temper. He merely took another step forward, forcing the lawyer back against the doorframe, and replied quietly that men of the sea deal with rats and roaches every day in the holds of ships, and they know exactly how to sweep the garbage off the deck. Desmond Foster swallowed hard, looked into Luke's dark, unflinching eyes, realized there was no cowardice or bluff in this man, turned on his heel and stomped out of the registry, defeated by his own arrogance. The room plunged into absolute silence following his turbulent exit. Silas Abernathy, who had been holding his breath during the entire exchange of barbs, finally exhaled noisily, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a cotton handkerchief, and resumed his calculations with impressive speed. In less than 30 minutes, the taxes were duly paid, the receipts issued and stamped, and the official deed to the Moor's land was signed, sealed, and permanently placed into Eleanor's hands. She clutched the thick document to her chest as if it were the most valuable treasure in all the oceans, feeling an overwhelming urge to cry, laugh, and scream with joy all at once. She was free from the chains of her past, free from Desmond's threat, and it was all thanks to the silent man standing beside her. They left the registry building and walked through streets now bathed in the soft golden light of the late afternoon. The atmosphere between them had irrevocably changed. The formality of their time on the boat and the fear of the previous days had given way to a deep, silent complicity. Luke walked her to the boarding house door, and instead of saying goodbye with a distant nod, as he had before, he leaned against the doorframe and said, with a half-smile that completely transformed his hardened features, that he would come by very early the next day before the sun was fully up, with hammers, saws, new nails, and good lumber bought at the docks, to start fixing that shingled roof full of holes. Eleanor smiled openly, her brown eyes shining with gratitude and something much larger and warmer that was beginning to take over her heart. She nodded and replied in a lightly teasing tone that she would brew a whole pot of Mrs. Pruitt's strongest coffee to keep up with his working pace. The solitary sailor, who had spent the last 7 years of his life trying to be invisible to the world, had finally found on the mainland the anchor he didn't even know he was looking for. And for the first time in a long while, he was anxious to see the next morning dawn. The sun hadn't even fully broken the horizon line the next morning when the rhythmic, heavy clatter of a cargo wagon's wheels echoed over the damp cobblestones of the street outside Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house. The cold dawn air still carried the thick moisture of the sea, but the sky was beginning to paint itself with pale shades of pink and lilac, promising a clear, cloudless day. Eleanor was already awake, wearing a thick cotton skirt and a long-sleeved blouse, her dark hair pinned firmly in a bun at the top of her head and her round glasses perfectly adjusted on her face. She held a metal thermos full of freshly brewed coffee and a basket with warm muffins that the widow insisted on packing for them. Before we head to the hills to follow the transformation of this old wooden house and the definitive blossoming of this unlikely love, leave a comment telling us if you've ever had to rebuild your life from scratch, just like our protagonist. And make sure to drop a like if Luke Vance's courage has won your heart too. The rented wagon was loaded to the brim with pale lumber smelling of fresh sawdust, dozens of new wooden shingles, and heavy iron tools. Luke held the reins of the two horses firmly. He wore rustic leather boots, denim trousers, and a grey cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong arms marked by old scars. His face, usually so closed off and unreadable, wore a serene and almost excited expression. He hopped down from the wagon with the agility of someone who had spent years leaping between ropes on moving vessels, took the basket from the teacher's hands, and helped her climb onto the wooden bench beside him. The touch of his rough hands on hers lasted only an instant, but it was enough to send a silent, familiar electric current through Eleanor's body. The sailor snapped the reins, and the wagon slowly began its ascent up the winding dirt road that led to the rural estates on the north side of the island. The journey took nearly 2 hours. The silence between them was no longer filled by awkwardness or the shadow of the past, but by a vibrant, almost palpable anticipation. The narrow road was flanked by massive trees that filtered the morning sunlight, creating golden patterns on the dirt floor. When they finally reached the crest of the hill, the view of the property opened up before them. The main house, with its weathered boards and hole-filled roof, looked even sadder and more desolate under the bright daylight than it had on the cloudy afternoon Eleanor first saw it. Tall weeds took over the entire yard, vines choked the porch columns, and a broken window on the second floor banged rhythmically in the breeze, letting out a ghostly creak of abandonment. Luke Vance, however, didn't see an insurmountable problem. The sailor's eyes, accustomed to judging the resilience of masts under violent storms, swept over the entire structure of the house with surgical precision. He didn't sigh in dismay. Instead, he tied the horses to a leafy tree near the spring, rolled up his sleeves a bit further, and declared aloud, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, that the bones of the house were made of genuine oak and pine and were perfectly intact. He explained to her that the rest was merely cosmetic, superficial rotting wood that could be replaced and loose shingles that needed to be swapped. Eleanor smiled, feeling her own anxiety evaporate in the face of the unwavering certainty of this formidable man. She uncapped the thermos, poured 2 cups of hot, strong coffee, and handed one to him. They toasted silently in the air, a mute pact of rebuilding and partnership, and the grueling, heavy labor began. The first 3 weeks were defined by colossal physical effort. Luke began working at dawn and only stopped when the darkness of night made it impossible to see the nails. He climbed onto the sloped roof and, with the agility of an acrobat of the sea, removed all the broken shingles and the wooden slats rotted by years of moisture. The sound of hammering echoed across the northern moors of Nantucket like the beats of a heart coming back to life. Eleanor didn't just stand by watching. She tackled the brutal cleaning of the house's interior. With a straw broom, buckets of warm water mixed with harsh lye soap, and an iron will, she swept out years of accumulated dust, dusted away countless cobwebs hanging from the high ceilings, and scrubbed the wide plank floors until the rich, original color of the wood re-emerged from beneath the grime. The teacher, who once had soft hands, accustomed only to holding chalk and silver pens, now sported calluses on her palms and dirt under her fingernails. She didn't care. For the first time in a long while, the exhaustion she felt at the end of the day wasn't born from anxiety or fear of tomorrow, but from the quiet, profound satisfaction of building something entirely her own. The daily coexistence and heavy labor created a natural, barrier-free intimacy between them. They no longer needed to fill the silence with formal conversation. A simple glance was enough for Eleanor to know Luke needed the bigger saw, or for him to realize she needed a break and a glass of cool spring water. In the late afternoons, when the golden-orange light of the setting sun flooded the green valley, they would sit together on the steps of the newly repaired porch. The smell of fresh sawdust mingled with the scent of cut grass. Luke, with his face and arms smeared with dirt and sweat, would light his old pipe, and Eleanor would read aloud passages from her little poetry book, the very one she had saved from the steamer wreck weeks before. In these peaceful pauses, moments of light, indirect flirting multiplied, warming the spectator's heart. When she read a passage about gardens blooming after a harsh winter, she would lower the book and smile at him, her brown eyes shining with a meaning that went far beyond the words on the page. Luke would return the look with a deep gaze and a rare half-smile that utterly transformed his hardened face, and their shoulders would touch lightly, neither making the slightest effort to pull away. The peace and progress of those 3 weeks, however, did not go unnoticed by the eyes of the man still prowling the town in search of revenge and easy profit. Desmond's silence had been a fake, strategic silence. The ex-fiancé hadn't returned to Boston after his public humiliation inside the chief clerk's office. He stayed on at a luxurious hotel in downtown Nantucket, using his shady connections and his money to investigate the life of the rugged sailor who had interfered with his plans, searching for any bureaucratic flaw, any lie, any excuse to tear Luke down and rip Eleanor away from that newly won land. The threat materialized on a muggy, oppressive Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast with thick clouds, hinting at rain. Luke was in the backyard of the big house, installing heavy iron hinges on a new wooden door that would lead to the outdoor kitchen, while Eleanor cleaned the freshly installed glass panes in the living room windows. The sound of rapidly approaching horses caught both of their attention. 3 men on horseback stopped abruptly in front of the property's fence, kicking up a cloud of dry dust. In the middle of them, riding a tall bay horse, was Desmond, wearing an immaculate overcoat and bearing an expression of arrogant triumph. Beside him were 2 uniformed men bearing the badges of the local harbor police. Eleanor rushed out of the house, wiping her hands on a damp dish towel, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Luke appeared right behind her, holding a heavy hammer in his right hand, his broad shoulders tensed and his posture shifting instantly into a dangerous state of high alert. The lawyer dismounted his horse with exaggerated elegance, adjusted the sleeves of his overcoat and walked toward the wooden fence, purposefully ignoring the sailor's presence and addressing only the teacher. With a venomous smile drawn on his thin lips, he announced, in a loud, deliberately theatrical tone, so the officers could clearly hear, that he was very sorry to interrupt their manual labor, but he had uncovered some extremely grave irregularities regarding Mr. Vance's vessel and the payment of the registry taxes. Desmond pulled a manila envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and waved it in the air like a trophy of war. He claimed, his voice dripping with false righteousness, that the money Luke used to pay the court costs on the day the deed transferred had no proven origin in maritime shipping logs. He accused the sailor directly and scandalously of smuggling contraband along the northern coast, alleging the funds were the fruit of illicit activities and that, consequently, the payment made to Clerk Silas Abernathy could be invalidated for fraud, with the assets seized by the harbor police. The lawyer finished his monologue by spewing his final venom, telling Eleanor that the man she thought was her savior was nothing but a sea criminal about to lose his boat and his freedom. and that her lands would soon revert to state control until everything was cleared up in court, a process that would take years and leave her once again in absolute poverty unless she accepted his legal help right that very minute. The accusation dropped like a bomb exploding in the quiet yard. Eleanor looked at Luke in panic, but the sailor's face showed no fear, terror, or guilt. His expression was one of pure, cold indignation. He didn't try to explain himself to the lawyer, nor did he beg the teacher to believe him. He simply tightened his grip on the hammer handle and locked his gaze on the uniformed officers. Luke knew the rotten gears of that port and knew that money bought accusations and invented evidence with frightening ease. The threat wasn't empty. The lawyer had spent whatever was necessary to forge a criminal complaint that would paralyze the sailor's life and block the land deed indefinitely. Bureaucracy was the only weapon the dandy knew how to wield with absolute lethality. Before one of the officers could pull out an official summons and arrest him on suspicion of customs fraud, the sound of a fourth buggy climbing the hill interrupted the grotesque scene. It was a simple town buggy, pulled by a tired horse, from which Mr. Silas Abernathy descended with some difficulty. The town's chief clerk was in a disheveled suit, his face red with sweat, his half-moon glasses practically falling off his nose. He clutched a leather briefcase bursting with heavy files against his chest and breathed heavily from the rushed trip up the hill. Silas walked swiftly over to the group standing near the fence. He ignored Desmond's pompous greeting, opened his leather case on the back of his tired horse, and pulled out a thick stack of papers bearing the original seals of the Merchant Marine and the Department of the Treasury. With a voice trembling from exhaustion, yet armed with unquestionable authority, the chief clerk ordered the officers to back down immediately and put away their forged warrants, because he possessed indisputable documentary evidence to the contrary. The old clerk had zero tolerance for cowardice, and over decades of public service had learned to sniff out bureaucratic scams from miles away. When Desmond Foster started sniffing around his registry, asking shady questions about the origin of the money Luke paid, Silas tapped his own contacts in the naval registries of the mainland ports to seek out the truth himself. Silas read aloud with the clarity of someone delivering an irrefutable verdict, the official records accumulated over nearly 10 years. The documents not only proved that Luke Vance was an honest and exemplary sailor in coastal shipping, but they also revealed something the New Englander himself had never told anyone. The large sums kept in the chest of the skiff were not the spoils of smuggling, quite the opposite. A portion of that money was the full, clean and duly taxed indemnity paid out by the maritime insurance after the sinking of Luke's old boat in 1905. The rest of the money saved over the years, the money he said merely gathered dust in the bottom of the boat, was the result of his methodical, continuous refusal to touch the insurance payout. He lived solely on the bare minimum earned from hauling light cargo, silently punishing himself for failing to save his 2 men on that stormy night. The payment made to the registry was lawful, properly tracked, clean, and incontestable in any court in the country. The revelation was met with stunning silence from everyone present. Desmond Foster's face lost all its arrogant color, morphing into a mask of profound shock and humiliating defeat. The lawyer realized, the moment the officers beside him lowered their heads in respect to the chief clerk's official seals, that he had no more cards up his sleeve. The charade had completely collapsed, and he was dangerously close to being arrested for a deliberate attempt at bureaucratic fraud and perjury against an officer of the court. Desmond didn't say another word. His arrogance had blinded him and destroyed his own defenses. He snatched the reins of his bay horse from one of the officers, mounted quickly, turned his back, and galloped off down the hill without even looking back, vanishing from Eleanor's life once and for all. The officers, embarrassed, offered formal apologies for the unfortunate misunderstanding, mounted their own horses, and rode back down the hill shortly after. When the dust on the dirt road finally settled, Luke slowly lowered the hammer, his chest rising and falling heavily, and looked at Clerk Silas with an expression of profound gratitude that words didn't need to describe. The old clerk smiled weakly, adjusted his slipping glasses, and said that bureaucracy was like the sea. It demanded respect, patience, and the paperwork to prove it. He then packed his heavy documents back into the briefcase, climbed back into the rented buggy, and headed back to town, leaving the two of them completely alone once again in the green yard of the property. Eleanor was paralyzed. The clerk's revelation about the origin of that money had opened a definitive window into the sailor's soul. She walked slowly toward him, her shoes leaving prints in the soft dirt. She stopped one step away and looked directly into Luke's dark eyes, seeing all the pain, the old guilt, and the immense sacrifice he had made for her. She understood in that moment that his act of paying the taxes wasn't just financial generosity. He had spent the untouchable insurance money, money stained by the guilt of his past, to wipe clean her future. He had let go of his own invisible penance because loving her mattered more than punishing himself for a storm he couldn't have controlled nearly 10 years ago. The teacher closed the final distance between them. She reached up with both calloused hands, hands that now knew the weight of brooms and hammers as well as they knew chalk, and cupped the sailor's rough, hardened face. With a voice choked by tears of deep gratitude and absolute love, she said that he would never again need to sail alone to run from his pain, because this place, this home rebuilt with the strongest wood and by his own hands, was his permanent safe haven. Luke did not pull back. The man of the sea closed his eyes for a second, allowing the final invisible tether of his pain to sever completely. When he opened them again, he didn't see the raging ocean of his loneliness reflected in her eyes, but rather the unwavering certainty of a real and mature love. He wrapped his arms around her waist in a crushing, protective embrace, and without saying a single word, kissed her under the shade of the porch they had built together. A kiss of unlikely encounters, of improbable fresh starts, sealing a silent promise that neither tempests nor time would ever be able to destroy. That moment sealed not just a passionate rescue, but a union built on timber and deep respect. Time, with its relentless march, did not erase their scars, but taught them to use them as the driving force of an entirely new life. And so we might understand the extent of this transformation. The calm waters of this story leap forward into the future. 8 years after Desmond's cowardly departure, the calendar reads December of 1920. The house in the hills no longer bears traces of past neglect and now overflows with life. The rotted woods of old have been replaced by pristine, whitewashed walls that contrast stunningly with the vibrant greens of climbing lilacs and blooming roses. A new, sanded, rustic wooden fence encircles a vast, productive orchard filled with apple trees and fragrant pears. On this spacious porch of polished floorboards sits a massive oak table surrounded by comfortable chairs, and a black-furred dog rests lazily in the gentle shade of the overhang, wagging its tail every so often. On the side of the sprawling grassy lot near the crystal spring stands an airy, freshly painted hall that smells not only of wildflowers, but of chalk, wax, and blank paper. It is the rural schoolhouse Eleanor dreamed of building. She is no longer the destitute teacher who nearly perished in the sea waters, and she answers to no distant heirs. She is the founder of her own classroom, teaching reading, arithmetic, and the magic of classic tales to dozens of sons and daughters of the neighboring farmers, a brilliant realization of independence, generosity, and a love for teaching. The front door of the painted house opened, and under the warm morning sun, Luke emerged. The years had subtly silvered some threads of the dark hair in his beard, but the ex-sailor's posture remained imposing and incredibly straight. His heavy hands were now accustomed not to wrestling unpredictable tillers in dark storms, but rather to the steady, patient swinging of hoes and scythes, tending to the corn and vegetable harvests. The rugged man, who once had no destination but escape, now wore clean work clothes, a woven straw hat, and carried an illuminated countenance that had long since chased away his fears. His silence had given way to easy laughter and timely jokes with the local friends of the region. He hadn't abandoned the sea entirely, keeping his old skiff repaired and safely stored on the shores of the bay, ready whenever they wanted to remember the journey. But he no longer fled into its furious waves. Eleanor walked across the porch to his side, carrying a pitcher full of freshly squeezed juice and 2 metal cups. Her simple dress fluttered slightly in the salty breeze, the mother-of-pearl clasps adorning her hair, framing the calm, serene face of someone who had conquered the worst of all destinies. Luke gently rested his calloused arm over his wife's petite shoulders. They exchanged a knowing smile of immense tenderness, those tranquil, secure looks of 2 people who had bravely faced the raging ocean, unscrupulous ambition, and the darkest, most painful griefs of their own pasts, refusing to sink into the sorrows of uncertainty. They had emerged victorious, mastering the blessed fresh start they had chosen to live together, uniquely and fully strengthened for all eternity. A love that became their firmest continent,